Okay, let's dive straight into what's been happening with the U.S. China trade situation. It feels like things have really escalated recently, and we want to unpack how it all unfolded based on recent reports.
Yeah, it's certainly been a busy few days, lots of action on both sides, really highlighting how complex this whole global trade thing is.
It really seems to have picked up speed with the U.S. under President Trump, increasing tariffs on Chinese goods. But this wasn't the absolute start of it, was it? There was stuff before this latest round.
That's right. If you go back to March, we saw those initial 20% U.S. tariffs, which were linked at the time to fentanyl concerns.
Ah, okay.
Then came what some called mirror tariffs, 34%, and China matched those with 34% on U.S. goods. So yeah, there was already this sort of tit-for-tat thing going on.
Gotcha. And then this latest move from China reports say they hiked tariffs on U.S. goods all the way up to 84%. That sounds like a really significant jump.
It absolutely is, up from that previous 34%. And it kicked in April 10th, 12:01 p.m. Beijing time.
So a big reaction. And that came right after the U.S. had pushed its tariffs up, right?
Exactly. Just the day before, April 9th, the U.S. had raised tariffs on some Chinese imports to 104%. So you see this very rapid sequence, one move seemingly triggering the next almost immediately.
And what's China saying officially about all this? They're pushing back, I assume.
Oh, definitely. The reports mention they're urging the U.S. to, quote, correct its wrong practices and get rid of these unilateral tariffs altogether.
So back to zero tariffs.
That seems to be the call. They're saying they want dialogue, but based on mutual respect. That seems to be their preferred route.
Dialogue, right. That theme keeps coming up in their statements as a sort of appeal to diplomacy.
Yeah, desire to step back from just slapping tariffs on each other and talk it through.
But it's not just tariffs they're using, is it? The reports we looked at mention other measures, too.
No, and that's a key point. They've also brought in export controls on, I think, 12 more U.S. companies and added 6 more to that list of unreliable entities.
Okay, and being on that list means restrictions, right? If you want to do business in China or with Chinese firms.
Precisely. So it's a broadening of the response beyond just the tariffs.
Mm-hmm.
These tools, the export controls, the list, they can be quite targeted and have, pretty serious consequences for the specific companies caught up in it.
Yeah.
Affects their supply chains, everything.
And they've taken this to the WTO as well.
Mm-hmm. They've appealed there, basically arguing that these back and forth tariffs aren't the way to fix trade imbalances and will actually end up hurting the U.S. too.
Interesting. Taking it to the global body.
Yeah, it's the multilateral approach.
Okay.
The WTO provides that framework for disputes, a way for China to make its case on the world stage.
So how did the U.S. react to China hitting back with the 84% tariffs?
Well, we saw a comment from the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. He called it a disappointing decision.
It's disappointing.
Pretty brief, but it signals a continued disagreement at the top levels about these policies.
So let's just recap the sequence real quick. Initial U.S. tariffs, fentanyl related, then 34% on both sides. U.S. bumps it to 104%. China responds with 84%. Wow, it really feels like the pace just picked up incredibly fast.
It really did. And while this was all happening, reports suggest Chinese officials were meeting, trying to figure out how to shield their own economy.
Makes sense. What kind of things were they looking at?
Ways to boost domestic consumption, stabilize their markets, possibly making tax benefits for their exporters more attractive, that kind of thing.
Right. Focus inward if exporting gets harder. And something about the currency, too, the yuan.
Yeah, the People's Bank of China reportedly asks state banks to buy less U.S. dollars, basically stepping in to support the yuan's exchange rate by buying yuan and selling dollars.
Okay, so direct action on the currency front.
Exactly. Trying to manage the potential fallout from the tariffs on the yuan. A weaker yuan could help exports a bit, theoretically, but it also brings other economic risks they need to weigh.
Now, shifting gears a little, President Trump's on comments on this. Some pretty strong language reported, right?
Yes, certainly. One report, I think it was The Independent, mentioned him claiming other countries are kissing his ass because they want the tariffs reduced.
Strong words.
Reflects a certain, shall we say, assertive negotiating style.
And he apparently doubled down at a Republican dinner, saying countries are dying to make a deal.
Mm-hmm. Claiming they're willing to do anything. It paints this picture of the U.S. having all the leverage with other nations desperate to meet U.S. demands.
And it wasn't just China initially, was it? Looking back at the reports, these tariffs announced earlier, April 2nd, were incredibly broad.
Oh, incredibly. Tariffs ranging from 10 to 50% on imports from, get this, 211 countries and territories.
Wow, 211. That's almost everywhere.
Basically. The stated reason was boosting the U.S. economy, and there was a claim of generating, I think, $2 billion a day in revenue from it.
$2 billion a day. That's
Yeah.
a lot.
It's a huge number, and one that economists would certainly want to analyze closely, both its accuracy and its overall economic effect.
So after that broad announcement, did countries start calling?
Apparently so. By April 9th, reports said around 70 countries had reached out to the White House with requests about the tariffs. Suggests widespread concern, obviously. Even Representative Tom Emmer commented on this flood of calls.
70 countries reaching out shows the impact.
Definitely underscores the shockwaves that initial announcement sent through the international community.
But there was another angle to this. Politico reported the White House wasn't exactly jumping to answer all those calls.
Right. That report suggested they weren't responding quickly, and more importantly, the administration hadn't really laid out what specific concessions it wanted from all these different countries.
So tariffs announced, but no clear demands.
It seemed that way initially. The report even quoted a Filipino official saying they weren't sure if the U.S. would even meet with them, and that lots of Southeast Asian countries had sent letters asking for talks. It raises questions, If you impose broad tariffs, what's the actual negotiation strategy? What do you want?
Yeah, that lack of clarity seems tricky for negotiations.
Absolutely. For talks to work, you need clear goals. If other countries don't know what's being asked, it's hard for them to engage.
And despite the talk of countries being desperate, some definitely pushed back, didn't they?
Oh, for sure. The reports are clear on that. We already talked about China's 84%. But Canada also announced retaliatory tariffs 25% on cars and trucks. And the European Commission was proposing 25% on some U.S. goods, too.
So definitely not universal acceptance, real pushback.
Exactly. It shows that unilateral tariffs often lead to this kind of chain reaction. It's how global trade works, or doesn't work sometimes.
Even the Kremlin commented.
Yeah, they described the situation as extremely uneasy, tense, and emotionally overloaded. They said they were taking steps to protect the Russian economy. Though it's worth noting, Russia and Belarus weren't actually hit by those U.S. tariffs.
Interesting. Shows the wider ripples, though.
For sure. These big trade disputes don't happen in a vacuum. Everyone's watching, assessing risks.
Okay, so just when you thought the U.S. China tension was peaking, President Trump announces another tariff hike via Truth Social.
Yes, another immediate increase. This time jumping to 125%. Effective immediately.
125%. Seriously.
That's what the report said. A huge jump, and it came just one day after the rate had hit 104%. Incredibly fast escalation.
Wow. And what was the message accompanying that?
The Post reportedly said China would soon realize that, quote, robbing the USA and other countries wasn't acceptable anymore. That kind of language, framing it as fighting unfair practices, often goes with these moves.
Right, reinforcing the justification for the tariffs. Okay, let's just lock in that timeline because it's wild. One day, U.S. tariffs are 104%, China's at 84%. The very next day, the U.S. leaps to 125%. That's volatile.
Extremely volatile. Highlights a very dynamic, maybe unpredictable trade situation right now.
And the administration's goals behind all this. The reports mention stimulating U.S. production.
Right. Stimulating U.S. production, bringing manufacturing back, and reducing the trade deficit. Those are the stated aims.
And Treasury Secretary Bessent had that comment about the trade imbalance, didn't he?
Yeah, he pointed out the U.S. imports about 5 times as much from China as it exports to China. His point was that this makes tariffs a losing situation for Beijing from the U.S. perspective.
Because China has more to lose in a tariff fight, basically.
That's the U.S. thinking, yes.
Yeah.
But the asymmetry makes China more vulnerable.
And China's reaction to the 125% hike. More of the same.
Pretty much. Again, calls for the U.S. to correct its practices, remove tariffs, resolve things through dialogue.
Yeah.
And again, mentioning their WTO appeal. Still pushing that multilateral angle.
Okay. And the potential damage from all this, the WTO had a stark prediction, didn't they?
Very stark. They reportedly warned of a potential 80% drop in trade between the U.S. and China because of this trade war.
80%. That's massive.
Huge. And they warned about the knock-on effects for the global economy, too, given the U.S. and China together are, roughly 30% of world trade?
Yeah.
An 80% drop in their bilateral trade would send shockwaves everywhere.
Yeah, you can see why they'd be worried. Global supply chains, businesses, consumers, everything gets hit.
Absolutely. The WTO's concerns seem very valid.
And Russia chimed in again.
The Russian Foreign Ministry reportedly voiced concern about this U.S.-China tariff fight intensifying and said they'd take measures to minimize damage to their own economy. Again, just showing how far the ripples spread.
It really paints a picture of global interconnectedness, doesn't it? Actions between two giants affect everyone.
Absolutely. No country is really an island in the global economy.
But then, just as things looked incredibly tense, a major plot twist. A pause on tariffs.
Yeah, quite a dramatic turn. President Trump announced on Truth Social a 90-day pause on major tariffs for over 75 countries.
A pause for 75 countries. Okay, what did that entail?
During that 90 days, a lower tariff, just 10%, would apply to those nations, effective immediately. So a big shift for a large chunk of U.S. trading partners.
Wow. So pulling back significantly for most countries. Why the pause? What was the reason given?
The specific reason stated was that these 75-plus countries had requested discussions about the tariffs and trade barriers, and this seems key. They had not taken any retaliatory actions.
So not retaliating and asking to talk got them the pause.
That appears to be the logic, yeah. Differentiating between those who hit back and those who sought dialogue first.
But crucially, this pause didn't apply to China, right?
Correct. Very important distinction. The announcement made it clear the pause and the 10% rate were not for China. For China, the tariff was still going up to 125%, specifically because they retaliated.
So China singled out for the high rate while others get a temporary break.
Exactly. Underscores that the core tension, the really sharp conflict, remains focused squarely on U.S. China trade.
It's interesting looking back at that initial April 2nd announcement. That hit around 180 countries, didn't it? With some rates pretty high, like Vietnam, Sri Lanka, Cambodia mentioned specifically.
Yeah, tariffs up to 49% in that first wave. It shows how broad the initial action was. And now this selective easing. Ukraine, for instance, apparently ended up in the 10% group for the pause. Russia, as we said, wasn't subject to tariffs anyway.
So a wide net initially, then a strategic pullback for many. Seems like maybe a recalibration based on who pushed back and who didn't.
That's one way to interpret it, certainly. Adjusting the strategy based on the international reaction.
How did the markets react to that first big tariff announcement, the really broad one?
Oh, very negatively.
Yeah.
Reports said key stock indexes saw record losses. Investors got really spooked about the potential economic damage.
Yeah, I remember seeing headlines about that. Market uncertainty.
Big time. It showed how sensitive markets are to these major trade policy shifts and worries about global growth.
And some big names in U.S. business were worried, too. Musk, Ackman.
Yes, reports mention concerns from figures like Elon Musk and Bill Ackman, warning about hits to the U.S. economy, business confidence, and especially consumers, particularly lower-income ones. Ackman actually called specifically for a 90-day pause.
And he kind of got it, for most countries anyway.
Partially, yes. It shows those concerns from the business world were definitely out there.
Okay, but then came the pause announcement. How did the markets react to that news?
A complete turnaround. Dramatic reversal. Reports detailed a massive surge in U.S. stock indexes, the S&P 500 up over 7%, Dow up over 6%, NASDAQ soaring over 9%.
Huge gains, so massive relief rally.
Exactly. It just shows how much weight that tariff uncertainty was putting on the market. The pause, even temporary and excluding China, was seen as a major positive de-escalation for a lot of the world.
The Wall Street Journal called it one of the best days ever for the indexes.
That's what one report said, yeah. Signifies just how powerful that positive reaction was.
Were there specific sectors doing well?
Oh, yeah. Energy stocks like Constellation Energy, Vistra saw big jumps, over 15%. And tech was flying. Tesla, Nvidia, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, all up significantly.
So the sectors maybe most exposed to broad tariffs bounce back hardest?
Looks like it. The market seemed to think the immediate threat to those areas was reduced, at least for these 90 days.
There was that quote from Adam Crisfoli at Vital Knowledge. What was his take?
He called it a sharp snapback, basically saying stocks were low, sentiment was bad, and the pause removed this giant overhang. But he added a note of caution.
Oh, what was the caution?
Just reminding everyone that the tariffs aren't gone, especially the huge rate on China, and asking, what happens after the 90 days. It highlights the temporary nature of the relief and the big question mark still hanging over U.S. China trade.
Right. The pause is just a pause. The underlying issues aren't resolved.
Precisely. And Sam Stovall from CFRA Research echoed that caution, suggesting the rally might be short-lived. Maybe the market hadn't truly bottomed out yet. Just a reminder that policy news can cause big swings, but the fundamental picture might still be uncertain.
Good point. Were other markets moving too? Commodities?
Yeah, commodities saw strong growth too. Brent crude oil was up almost 4%. Copper prices jumped significantly as well. Suggests a broader positive sentiment shift across assets.
And the dollar.
The U.S. dollar strengthened, particularly against the Japanese yen. The yen is often a safe haven, so seeing it weaken suggested less demand for safety, more risk appetite.
Okay. And this rally was a stark contrast to the days just before.
Absolutely. Reports noted that April 9th started slightly down before turning positive, but that followed 4 straight sessions of big losses. The S&P 500 had dropped 12%, Nasdaq over 13% just in those few days because of the tariff fears. CNBC called them the worst losses since the pandemic.
Wow. So the pause announcement really flipped the script in the markets.
Completely. Just highlights how incredibly sensitive markets were to every twist and turn in this tariff story.
It's certainly been a roller coaster of developments in global trade, all packed into a very short space of time.
Indeed. The sheer speed of the announcements, the reactions, the reversals, it really underscores how fluid and interconnected the whole global economic picture is right now.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear, new episodes every day.